Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. So, I want you to think about the last time you walked out of a movie theater arguing with a friend about what a film actually meant. You both sat there, you watched the exact same images on the exact same screen, but somehow you walked away with two completely different interpretations. How does that even happen? Well, today we're going to dive deep into the really fascinating academic concept of spectatorship. We're looking at how the meaning of incredibly complex films like Todd Phillips's Joker and Barry Jenkins's Moonlight isn't just handed to us on a silver platter. Instead, meaning is actually built by us. It's like a giant puzzle, and we're the ones putting the pieces together. Okay, let's jump right in. Here is our quick roadmap for today. We're going to cover the active spectator, decoding film form, context and cultural capital, ideology and personal lens, and finally, the meaning you make. All right, section 1, the active spectator. Think about your own role when you grab your popcorn and the lights go down in the theater. Are you just this empty vessel waiting to be filled with the director's ideas? Well, according to Stuart Hall's 1970s encoding and decoding model, which is sometimes called reception theory, you absolutely are not. Meaning isn't fixed at all. It's actively constructed through a really dynamic interaction. The filmmaker encodes their messages using things like camera angles, music, and dialogue, but then you, the spectator, actually have to decode them. You are an active producer of meaning, not just a passive recipient. Hall basically theorized that there are three distinct ways we react after decoding a text. First up is the preferred reading. This is where you completely understand and totally agree with the filmmaker's ideology. Second is the negotiated reading. This is where you get the message, but you only agree with it up to a point, maybe adding your own little caveats. And finally, there's the oppositional reading, where you understand the message perfectly well, but you just completely reject or disagree with it. Keep this mental framework in your back pocket because we're going to use it a lot today. Moving right along to section 2, decoding film form. Let's look at exactly how directors hide or encode meaning directly into the cinematography and the very structure of a film. Notice the stark visual contrasts in Joker. Early on, the director frequently frames Arthur Fleck behind physical barriers. We're talking screens, windows, or heavy chain link fences. That literally encodes his isolation, his distance from society, and maybe even a feeling of incarceration. But contrast that with his transformation into the Joker. Suddenly, he's out in the open on those iconic outdoor steps. The steps that used to represent his uphill, everyday struggle are now a stage. He moves with this fluid, almost bionic swagger. The cinematography itself is practically shouting at us about his shifting identity. And that brings up a massive question that really requires your active media literacy. Is it all in Arthur's head? Joker relies heavily on unreliable narration, but the thing is, it rarely holds your hand and explicitly tells you what is real and what's just fantasy. Things like his imagined relationship with his neighbor Sophie require the spectator to pick up on some very, very subtle narrative cues. For example, think about the matching hospital clock that appears at completely different points in the movie. It's a very quiet, subtle visual clue that strongly suggests a whole lot of what we are seeing might be entirely imagined by Arthur. If a spectator isn't deeply film literate, or maybe just isn't attentive enough to decode a tiny cue like that, they might produce a completely literal reading of the events. And if you read the events literally, well, that drastically alters your moral judgment of Arthur's violent actions. Now, let's look at Barry Jenkins' Moonlight. The film uses a triptych structure, meaning it's broken down into 3 distinct chapters of the protagonist's life: childhood as Little, adolescence as Chiron, and adulthood as Black. A structure like this practically demands a film-literate spectator. The director leaves these huge, glaring gaps between the life stages, which requires you to actively stitch together the psychological continuity of the character over years and years of unseen trauma and change. So, the absolutely crucial point here is how Jenkins actually connects those 3 stages. He encodes this continuity through visual motifs. We see recurring blue hues and imagery of mirrors and water woven throughout all 3 acts. It's a way to show that the adult Black is still psychologically connected to the child Little, despite his hardened exterior. But catching these motifs demands sustained, active attention to fully decode. You really have to lean in. All right, on to section 3, context and cultural capital. It's crazy to think about, but what we know outside the theater drastically changes what we see inside it. That background knowledge, that's what we call cultural capital. Think about the scene where Arthur sneaks into Wayne Hall. The Gotham elite are sitting there watching Charlie Chaplin's 1936 classic, Modern Times. Recognizing that ironic intertextual reference immediately deepens the encoded message about Gotham's massive class divide. Similarly, if your cultural capital includes a deep knowledge of DC Comics lore, or an understanding of 1970s New York, or even Martin Scorsese films like Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy, you are going to decode Arthur's descent into madness very, very differently than someone without that specific context. But hey, it's not just what you know, it's also where you are. The physical conditions of your viewing heavily influence your reading. When Joker was released, remember the intense media discourse surrounding its perceived links to real-world violence? If you watched it in a crowded cinema during that specific time, that environment might have created anxiety or critical distance, making you way more likely to adopt an oppositional reading to Arthur. On the flip side, watching it entirely alone in a private living room might facilitate a more intimate, negotiated reading, where you identify a bit closer with his subjectivity. And as we just noted with Moonlight, its quiet, contemplative style strictly requires highly attentive viewing conditions just to catch its underlying meaning. Cultural context also plays a massive role in our baseline expectations. Consider how Moonlight depicts its setting. The film was shot in a social, realist, naturalistic style right on location in Liberty City, Miami. For a lot of mainstream audiences, this completely subverts the typical glamorous Hollywood stereotypes of Miami beaches and neon lights. Spectators with different cultural backgrounds will react to this depiction entirely differently, just based on their own lived experiences and what they've been trained to expect from mainstream cinema. Which brings us to Section 4, Ideology and Personal Lens. Our own personal politics act as an incredibly powerful filter for everything we watch. Because the encoding in Joker is deliberately so ambiguous, the film generates wildly different ideological readings. We can actually map these out quite neutrally. On one hand, a spectator with a progressive ideology might adopt a preferred reading that sees Joker as a tragic victim of capitalist inequality, focusing heavily on the cuts to his social services and his dead-end low-paid job. But on the other hand, a spectator with a more traditional conservative ideology might produce an oppositional or negotiated reading. They might look at the exact same scenes and see a story about the breakdown of the rule of law, the cultural danger of lacking strong male role models, and a total failure of individual personal responsibility. The film is literally a mirror reflecting the viewer's own politics. We actually see a really similar dynamic play out with Moonlight. The film is broadly socially liberal, asking audiences to look at the systemic root causes behind a character's life path. A progressive reading is going to focus heavily on how Chiron's identity is shaped by social pressures and marginalization. On the flip side, an oppositional reading, perhaps grounded in values reminiscent of the Reagan-era war on drugs, might argue that while circumstances are undeniably tough, an individual is ultimately entirely responsible for their life outcomes, and criminality remains a personal choice. We are observing firsthand how the spectator's pre-existing lens dictates the meaning they extract from the screen. A really helpful way to understand the complex encoding of Moonlight is through this specific quote regarding the concept of intersectionality. The film explicitly asks the spectator to grapple with the fact that Chiron isn't just dealing with one isolated issue. He's navigating the intersection of being Black, being gay in a hyper-masculine environment, and growing up in poverty. An active spectator has to untangle all these layered challenges when forming their moral judgments about the character's eventual path in life. Finally, Section 5, The Meaning You Make. Let's tie all these academic threads into a single, empowering takeaway. Meaning emerges through the interaction between encoding and decoding. The directors, Todd Phillips and Barry Jenkins, they just provide this cinematic blueprint. They use cameras, lighting, and scripts to encode ideas. But the film is not finished until you sit down to watch it. The final emotional and intellectual weight of the film is built entirely by you, the active spectator. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought to really interrogate your own biases the next time the credits roll. When you watch Joker or Moonlight, or honestly any film you love, how did your unique cultural capital, your physical viewing conditions, and your own personal ideology shape the meaning you walked away with? What did you encode and what did you decode? Thank you so much for watching The Explainer, and keep being an active spectator.